I'll let
All
you
right,
take it.
everybody. I'll just introduce myself and then I'm going to make the camera go away because this isn't about me. It's about Canadian hardwoods. I have been in the lumber business for 34 years. The last decade before COVID, I traveled the world talking to architects and designers about using wood in our built environments. Whereas Yancey, just before me, was talking about cladding for exteriors. What I talk about is wood for interiors. And today I'm representing the Canadian Hardwood Bureau. I've been honored to ask to speak on their behalf, and we'll be talking about wood for our built environment. So with that, I'm going to close the camera and we'll just get on to the presentation. My first name is unusual, but at the end of this session, you'll really be connected to the guy who runs the Canadian Hardwood Bureau. Oops, I've got to do this and then this. So this is approved by the GBCI for credit. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the CHB. The Canadian Hardwood Bureau is the national trade association representing Canadian manufacturers and wholesalers of hardwood lumber and flooring and their suppliers. The CHB's goal is to represent Canadian hardwood lumber and flooring products through education and awareness activities. So we provide the promotional and technical information on behalf of the industry, but there are no SKUs at the end of this that you can lock onto for your specs. I'm hopefully going to give you a good broad brushstroke look at Canadian hardwoods as they can be used in our built environment. So at the end of this course, if I do my job properly, you will understand the role of hardwoods in biophilic design and its effect on the health and welfare of those occupying those built spaces. You'll be able to discern the benefits of using real wood as opposed to wood imitators in your designs. You'll be able to understand and maybe explain the basics of the different available species of Canadian hardwoods and their wide myriad uses in the built environment. You'll be able to discuss somewhat intelligently the sustainable management of Canadian hardwood resources, explain how harvesting and using Canadian hardwoods can help mitigate climate change through carbon sequestration for generations to come. It sounds counterintuitive to say harvesting improves the resource, but it does, and I'll explain that as we get into it. In this discussion, I had to find, I've been doing this for a long time. I've talked to more than 15,000 architects and designers, and at the very beginning of this journey, I had to find a good place to start. And I think this is a good place. Let's start by defining what we mean when we say hardwoods. Some of you in the audience may understand all this, so forgive me for being redundant with information you already know, but there may be some people who don't. Hardwoods are the broadleaf trees. Those are called angiosperms, and they generally lose their leaves in winter. This happens to be a white oak. Quercus alba is its genus. And now we'll go into softwoods, this is general parlance, by the way. Softwoods are wood produced by coniferous trees, cone-bearing. They're gymnosperms, and softwoods are evergreens. But you have to remember this, that softwood doesn't necessarily refer to the hardness of the lumber. Some softwoods are harder than some hardwoods. So don't get lost in the gray area there. And I gave a talk in New Zealand once, and somebody said, we have deciduous evergreens, or we have deciduous softwoods here in New Zealand. And I didn't want anybody to get lost in that gray area. So virtually all of you know about biophilic design and biophilia, but it's important to sort of run through it quickly that biophilic design recognizes how much human and physical mental well-being relies on the quality of our relationships to the natural world. Business Insider had this great quote that I thought was worthy of republishing. Indoor and outdoor boundaries will become increasingly blurred, catering to something called biophilia, which is the theory that people instinctively feel more at ease in natural feeling surroundings. Now, this phrase was coined by a Harvard-educated American biologist, Edward O. Wilson, and he coined the phrase to mean the connections that human beings subconsciously seek with the rest of life. George Nakashima, who, if you're not familiar with his furniture, is one of the more amazing furniture makers. Sadly, he passed away several years back, but his family still runs his studio down in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. But he has a great number of quotes that are really spot on in terms of biophilic design. He says, when trees mature, it's fair and moral that they're cut for man's use, as they would soon decay and return to the earth. Trees have a yearning to live again, perhaps to provide beauty, strength, and utility to serve man, even to become an object of great artistic worth. I'll throw in one more quote that I think is great from Frank Lloyd Wright, who says, wood is the most humanly intimate of all materials. So I had to understand this for myself, and I now, when I travel and give presentations in person, I will usually challenge the audience to mount a cogent and coherent argument against the notion that we all just feel better in a built environment that's clad with wood, in flooring, furniture, joinery, cabinetry. And for myself, I had to think this through. Why is it that we feel better, even if we can't quantify it or qualify it? Why do we all agree? By the way, nobody has ever taken me up on that challenge. Everybody, even if it's tacit approval, nobody has said, no, I disagree with that idea. We all agree that interiors clad in wood are just better. But why is it? It's because humans are like hardwood trees in 4 significant and profound ways. And I've recently found that there's a 5th way, which I'll add in as a bonus. But we both consist of about 60% water. And we both consist of approximately 18% carbon. We both have a peak lifespan of about 80 years, and I do want to qualify that and saying, yes, you've seen trees like the great sequoias and other trees around the world that have stood in the forest for way more than 80 years, centuries in some cases. But, and so some humans can live into their 110, 115, and in some cases a little older than that. But trees and humans will reach that point, and it's around 80 years where we are simply less productive, more susceptible to disease or injury. And I have a good friend whose mother at 85 years old, vibrant golfer all of her life, and 85 fell and broke her hip and really never recovered. So, and when you talk about trees, they really have one job in the biosphere, and that's to absorb carbon. And they provide an ecosystem for animals and such, but their basic job is absorbing carbon. So once they reach that peak life and start to become more susceptible to injury and disease, they start to leach that carbon back into the atmosphere, which will come into play when we talk about sustainable forestry, because we want to find those trees and take them out of the forest, which opens the canopy and allows rain and sunlight to reach the forest floor, because those trees and hardwoods have been seeding the forest floor their whole lives. So we just need to get light and rain to that forest floor. So the last similarity is that when you design using wood for your interior spaces, you have to remember that all humans and trees are unique. So don't try to design a space with the notion, as would be for, let's say, that aluminum exterior cladding. You don't want to design assuming that every board's going to look, whatever species, walnut, red oak, white oak, that's going to look exactly like the board that's next to it in the floor. You have to design with the notion that all trees, even 2 trees harvested within 10 yards of each other, are going to look different in application. An important point to make about this too is that we live in symbiosis with trees, which is another reason we resonate with them. We exhale CO2, the trees inhale it, they clean the air and give us back oxygen. And this is how trees can reduce the effects of climate change, by reducing greenhouse gases. And this is actually a true representation of tree roots and our lungs. So this symbiosis is really critical for the planet. That's why in some countries, you'll see that they have planted, like India planted 2.5 million trees in one day several years back, and countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, China, they're planting trees with a real sense of urgency to try to absorb the CO2 that's been leached, whether you want to be on one side of the fence or the other about whether it's man-made or not. Greenhouse gases as an empirical data point are increasing every year. So we in North America, and specifically talking today about Canada, we have been on this for well over 100 years of maintaining a vibrant, rotating crop of trees. The bonus thing that we share with trees is we share I double checked this with about 6 different scientific sites. We share about 50% of the DNA with trees. And we do stand erect as trees do. We have arms like branches, and our trunks are vulnerable, but we keep growing upwards, and so there's that similarity to trees as well. When it comes to designing with Canadian hardwood, you want to know that Canadian hardwood meets the needs of contemporary design, and it's renewable, sustainable, beautiful, has a wide range of uses for flooring, furniture, millwork. And specifically about Canadian hardwoods is its beauty lies in slow growth trees with tight growth rings and excellent consistent color in the oaks, small hearts in the maples. And the thing to understand about growth rings is, I think all of us when we were school children understood that you look at the end of a log and you can count the growth rings and determine how old that tree was. But what you have to understand about growth rings is the ring itself, the hard part of that ring, is like a cuticle. It's where the tree has ceased growing at the end of its season. And what you'll see in between there is cellular structure that represents how long the growing season was. So the further south, let's say in a red oak, further south you go in North America, the longer the growing season. So you have a wider expanse between those two. That cuticle is called late wood, is where the tree stopped growing. So the wider that expanse is, the fewer growth rings per inch you get, the more likely that wood is to move and shrink and expand. The more growth rings per inch, it means shorter growing season. And that is what happens in Canada. We have a shorter growing season. So you have the tight growth rings equate to more stability in the wood. And we also get consistent color because those growing seasons are so short. I'll illustrate all this for you. And by the way, I want to also say that anything technical you feel I'm not hitting on during the presentation, we have a wealth of information in the Dropbox at the end of the presentation. But I sort of have to keep things moving along and just giving you the aesthetics and a sense of sustainability. This is a beautiful biophilically designed space with Canadian ash floor and windows looking out to the woods. So that'd be a relaxing place to read your book. I have to use this example because it's, in my mind, the quintessential biophilically designed house. This is in Pennsylvania, our southern neighbor. This is Falling Water in Pennsylvania. Frank Lloyd Wright designed this, and one has to just glance at it to understand you would feel better living in that house, even with the concrete. But now, in terms of biophilic design, architects and designers are both understanding the benefit, in this case in a healthcare environment, of bringing the flora into the space. Not only is the furniture made from wood, the floor is made from wood, the shelves are made from wood, but you actually have growing plants and trees in that space. And as I'll show you going forward here, the sympathetic nervous systems of people who are patients waiting to be treated or loved ones of patients who are being treated, this wood in this space and the growing trees will relax the sympathetic nervous systems of those in the space. This is a great biophilic space. This is a vacation cabin, happens to be owned by a friend of mine. And the people in that corner looking out, especially those looking out at the woods, they're surrounded by wood, and they are subconsciously more relaxed and able to share a more meaningful period of time with their friends, having coffee or drinks or tea, whatever it is. This is a more stark contemporary environment. This is in Vietnam, and they've let the plants grow up the side of the building to serve as sort of a buffer between this interior space and the street. And you can see these nice, comfortable chairs there. This would be a great place to sit and have your tea in the morning. All of this brings me to the topic of forest bathing. And in Japan, apologies to anybody here who speaks Japanese, because I don't, Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, is an actual prescription you can get in Japan to help reduce the physical effects of stress in your life. And all of us live stressful lives. They've gotten to be more stressful since COVID has hit. But in Japan, all of our stressors will eventually manifest in our physical being. So in Japan, you go to a doctor and say, I'm not sleeping well, or I'm agitated, I'm anxious. Your doctor may prescribe forest bathing, which is defined as spending a couple of hours of thoughtful time in the forest. And there are books you can find on this. This is just an illustration of a family going into the woods and enjoying a peaceful walk. This Dr. Lee has written a great deal about it. I don't hawk his books or anything, but he has just written a book that I really like. But he says the art of forest bathing is the art of connecting with nature through our senses. This is the front of his book, and it just happens to be great, but I love how he says how trees can help you find health and happiness. Now, looking at biophilic design in healthcare, which is something I can speak to from personal experience, and I'll show you in a moment what I mean by that. FP Innovations and the University of British Columbia did a deep dive into this, and you can find this wood and human health if you just Google it. They did this deep dive to find out if wood in a healthcare environment did have ameliorative effects, beneficial effects to patients. And the takeaway is that in the study, the presence of visual wood surfaces in a room lowered sympathetic nervous system activation. The SNS is responsible for physiological stress responses in humans. This result opens the door to myriad stress-related health benefits that the presence of wood may afford in the built environment. And the application of wood to promote health indoors is a new tool for practitioners of evidence-based design. My experience with this was, sadly, in 2013, I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And I went in for a biopsy, thinking that I would be able to go home with my wife and just be groggy from the anesthetic. But instead, I woke up in the ICU where I remained for 5 days, and it was all a lot worse than they thought. But the environment in which I opened my eyes was completely terrifying to me. It was just machines, tile, stainless steel, no windows, and I couldn't speak because of the biopsy, but I wrote a note to my wife that just said, this is terrifying. So we're going to contrast that with 2 years later, I succeeded in surviving that, obviously, because it's 2022 and I'm still alive. But then 2 years later, I got another diagnosis of cancer, which was a little less traumatic, but I was able to wake up in this room. This was my room that was lined with maple cabinetry and maple floors, and I just felt better. And this biophilic design in healthcare, they have proven through tests that patients require less pain medication and stay in the hospital for a shorter period of time. So now you see designers and architects bringing actual trees into the lobbies and wood furniture. And here's an example of a doctor catching up on his notes, perhaps between surgeries or visits with patients. So in this environment, he's actually, whether he knows how much it's affecting him or not, he's actually able to focus on his work and relax a lot better than he would in some windowless office somewhere in the belly of the hospital. So in terms of residential design, the more wooden cabinetry you put into your house, the more wooden furniture and flooring, the happier everyone will be in that space. This is a great example. Here's a great example of white walls, but you have nice wood dining hutch and table and chairs, and people at that table are going to just simply feel better, less stressed. This is an example of designing without trying to make every board look the same. This is hickory flooring in a pretty contemporary and stark space, but it gives a depth to that room that would not otherwise exist, for example, if all of the boards look the same. So that's why I say, just let all of it go. Let all of the natural characteristics go in your designs. That way people will know that this wood actually came from a forest, from a real tree. Now with the magic of computers, I can take that same space and put into it walnut flooring, a beautiful chevron pattern there, that wherein the designers have left all the little knots and all the little bits of sapwood and all of the character. There was a time in the 90s where people referred to a knot, designers referred to a knot as defects. And suddenly around the new millennium, people started to understand that those are character. And I used to sell hardwood lumber. I sold lumber for, 14 years to large scale manufacturers of furniture and flooring. And I was always baffled by the idea that people wanted to have defect-free or character-free wood. To me, that looked very bland. But around the year 2000, people started to ask me for character wood. So this is what they would get. I had one flooring manufacturer said, if the board will stay together and not blow up in my flooring molder, I'll use it. I'll fill the holes with black resin and make a beautiful floor. So this is an example of painted and clear coated wood in this space, a relaxing space. And with COVID, all of us working from home, myself included, if we have a beautiful credenza like this, where we can focus surrounded by wood, that has been proven to be beneficial. This is a gorgeous, and for me, aspirational wine cellar made with Canadian hardwoods. And this is just a really relaxing space in which you can choose the next bottle of wine for your dinner. It also, through myriad tests, been shown that people who sleep in a wood bed or sleep on a wood bed frame, they actually get deeper sleep and feel more rested when they wake up in the morning. So surrounding yourself with wood in your bedroom is a good way to go as well. This is another dining hutch, a beautiful use of Canadian hardwoods. This is Marana Kitchens again. They do spectacular work. And this is, again, for me, an aspirational entertainment room with a huge screen in it, but this is all Canadian hardwoods as well. Bringing wood into the bathroom has been of great benefit, and wood used to be excluded from bathrooms, but now you're seeing it more and more for people to feel more relaxed throughout the house. So I had to take a drink of water right then, and of course I had difficulty swallowing it. Biophilic design in hospitality and commercial settings are worthy of note. This is a government conference room in Ottawa. This is all Canadian maple, and it's a spectacular piece of furniture building. And subconsciously, everybody who's at that table is going to be able to focus on materials presented in this meeting, even though they don't really know it. It's just going to be a subconscious thing. The students studying in wood-clad libraries, they absorb information better. They're more aware of what they've just read. And again, there are tests to back this up. You can use the Google machine to verify. This is a great commercial staircase. This is a Canadian beach. And the great thing about it is it will look the same way in 100 years. With some light maintenance, it's a hardwood and it will stand up to that foot traffic, and it's a beautiful use of wood. This is a more elegant traditional setting. This is the Four Seasons in Ottawa. This is a beautiful look of the way buildings were built in the early 1900s. But with all this wood surrounding you, you could imagine having a nice relaxing cup of tea or coffee or drinks with friends or family or business associates. In education, as I said, in wood-clad libraries, they've done tests and find that students are more relaxed, and they will absorb, by being more relaxed, they absorb the information a lot more easily. So in education, this is taken on a job site. This is a new school in Canada, and even where they couldn't use wood in the floors, they've used wood accent pieces on the walls to let the students feel as though they're in the forest. This is a very contemporary use of that. Because these are job site photographs, you'll see the occasional hard hat. This is a reception desk made with Canadian hardwoods. And here's another one where it's got to offset the tile carpets to give a sense of living space with that. There you see another hard hat there, but this is a great little corner nook made out of Canadian cherry where a student or professor could sit, recharge their computer and look out at the woods outside and see the beautiful trees and just basically recharge both your computer and yourself. I'm particularly enthralled with the way entry doors look to all houses of worship, and it doesn't matter the denomination of the church. A traditional use of wood is in the entryway. And these same woods that I've been talking about that are great for interior use can be used in vertical applications outside. I don't recommend, for example, using walnut on a deck because in a horizontal use, it will be destroyed. But in vertical use indoors, it can last for hundreds of years. You'll see cathedrals in Europe that have had the same wood doors for hundreds of years. But I think it's just a beautiful way to welcome people into this otherwise stone-lined space. So these are just examples with the stained glass windows at the top. I'm going to make one mention of residential doors for interiors. This is a soft maple door, solid core door that will offer sound attenuation, which is valuable in some houses where you want to close off one part of the house from noise. And then if it's a part of your larger house that you want to close off for the winter, it will also hold cold on one side and warmth on the other without leaching through. But it's also holding carbon, which cannot be said for artificial door. Entry doors, same as entering a house of worship. You want to welcome people into your home with a beautiful wood door. This is a more rustic wood entryway to a home. So there's no comparison in terms of performance, beauty, environmental health benefits, long-range economy, and carbon sequestration between solid hardwoods and imitators. Imitators like bamboo, tile, and plastics, they aren't carbon stores. They're all produced through high carbon emissions process. Emission processes, I should say correctly. So bamboo is an example. It's not wood. Even though I've seen it marketed occasionally as bamboo wood, it's really a reedy grass. So taking that grass and rendering it into something resembling a wood board involves possibly carcinogenic resins and high carbon emissions in the manufacture. So same can be said for all imitators of solid hardwood. Many use plastics and glues and resins that contain ingredients that can be harmful to humans, and off-gas elements like formaldehyde at dangerous levels. I want to just, in the interest of full disclosure, say that wood has formaldehyde naturally in it. We have formaldehyde naturally in us. But when you create an imitator, an artificial imitator of wood, it's going to be able to off-gas formaldehyde at very dangerous levels. So while some imitators may look like solid hardwoods, even those that contain wood biomass, like MDF and particle board, they may be bound by resins and adhesives that are possibly dangerous. The bottom line is there's no comparison to the real thing. So when talking about subtropical forests, rainforests, the amount of carbon this forest loses due to tree replacement by bamboos equals the amount of carbon liberated through clear cutting of the forest. So it's an important point that I will reemphasize, that when we think of the rainforest, all of us have in our minds the burning of the rainforest and absolute deforestation, which is not necessarily the case. But what happens here in Canada and in America, we value what grows on the land. And in some areas of the world where there are rainforests, the indigenous people value the land itself versus the timber that grows on the land. So they want to convert that land to agricultural uses like cattle grazing, planting bamboo, and palm for pet food and cosmetics. So it's important to value the trees that grow on the land. So from the Hardwood Specifiers Guide, which you'll get in the Dropbox at the end of this presentation, you have to keep in mind that Canadian hardwood's is a natural design solution. It's beautiful, remarkably practical, and it's environmentally friendly, recyclable, and biodegradable. It can give every space a unique look. It's strong and durable, and it's an excellent alternative to metal or plastic. It can be styled, shaped, and stained to really create any mood. And you may not be gaining economies by shifting to an imitator, much as you think you might, because Canadian hardwood in application will last for generations. So solid hardwood has long been the preferred material for flooring, wall, paneling, molding, and furniture in kitchens and bathrooms, and it all adds a warmth and comfort, contrasting beautifully with marble, stainless steel, or tile, as you saw in some of those pictures earlier. This is about the most technical I'll get in talking about wood, and that's the Janka scale, or I've presented in Australia and New Zealand several times and was quickly corrected that they refer to it as the Yanka scale. Regardless of how you pronounce that word, it's universally accepted. It's a measurement of how much force, pounds per square inch, does it take to press that 0.444 millimeter steel ball into the face of that flooring board to a depth of half of its diameter. So with that in mind, then you can look at the Janka or Yanka scale. This is but a microcosmic look at species around the world, but the less pressure it takes on a balsa wood, 100 pounds per square inch, you can run your thumbnail across a balsa wood board and leave an indentation. And as you go up 480 pounds per square inch, hemlock's 500, then you get to fir, which is 660. Now you're getting into hardwoods with cherry at 950, walnut is a 1010, and birch jumps up to 1260. So what this indicates, if you're designing with cherry or walnut, for example, you have to understand that in a high traffic area, it's going to be easier to mark that flooring up with gravel carried in from outside or just spiked heels. So you want to look a little higher than that. Birch at 1260 is just slightly under red oak at 1290. Beech is that, remember that interesting staircase, that's made out of beech, that's 1300. Getting to ash, which is 1320. White oak is 1360, and the hardest of the North American hardwoods is hickory at 1820. And ipe, which is a rainforest wood, clocks in at 3684. So for decking use, it's going to hold up really well to the elements. But so just look the Janka scale up or Yanka scale up when you're going to design, especially when you're talking about a high traffic area. So reviewing the commercially available species in Canada, our most prolific species is the hard maple. It grows fast. It's got really beautiful autumn foliage. It's versatile. You'll find it in general times when you would see it. It's going to be in a basketball court, but it's also in furniture and cabinetry. You'll hear the term bird's eye maple from time to time, and it's not a different species. It's just an interesting mutation of the cells of the hard maple tree. This distortion produces this series of small concentric circles that actually look like bird's eyes, but it's a rare distortion, so it's prized by furniture makers, luthiers making guitars, but in its rarity, it becomes more expensive. So that would be a really high-end design that would use bird's eye maple. Soft maple, like its name implies, is about 25% softer than hard maple, but it's great for staining and enamel finishes. Because it's softer, it can be stained to look like more expensive species like walnut and cherry. So it's very versatile and a wonderful wood to work with. White birch is also called paper birch. It's whiter than yellow birch, and softer than yellow birch. You'll find yellow birch used in a lot of cabinetry, especially cabinetry that's painted, because you'll have more of a sap and heart contrast with yellow birch. And when we're talking about terms, sap is the cambium layer of the log or the tree that's actively growing, in the heart. In the case of red birch, that's all heart cuttings. That's where the tree stopped growing. And now the white wood is where it's still growing. Ash, interesting side note here, that ash trees are disappearing quickly because of a little bug came in from China to Detroit in the late 1990s. It's called the emerald ash borer. And while it's no longer than the diameter of a penny, it can really destroy ash trees quickly because it burrows into the cambium layer, the actively growing layer of the tree, and cuts off all of the feeding roots of the capillaries from the roots to the canopy. So if you see a tree that's standing in the forest that has, in the midst of other trees, no canopy leaves, that's probably an ash that has started to die because it can't get nutrients to the leaves at the top of the tree. There are more and more active people who are using the logs from these dying trees and rendering them into furniture and the like, because the log itself is fine. It just stopped growing. So it's not ruined forever, but we're losing ash trees. Canada, with its slower growing season, seems to have not been as decimated, but someday ash will be limited here in Canada as well. Red oak it's sort of the granddaddy of all furniture, wood, and flooring. It's hard, but it's really easy to work with and stain. And its cousin, the white oak, is almost imperceptibly different. You can look at, some even experts like myself can look at a white oak board and a red oak board, and the colors might be the same. And the only way to discern the difference sometimes is to look at the end grain, because the difference lies in the porosity of the two species of wood. It all centers around the W for white oak, because white oak works with whiskey, water, and wine. You can build a ship out of white oak, but you can't out of red oak, because those capillaries I referred to earlier that bring nutrients from the roots up to the canopy, in red oak, when you kill dry the board, those capillaries remain open. You can actually blow a bubble through a piece of red oak, which you can't with white oak. Another technical term you don't have to remember, there's no test after this presentation, but it's a cell structure called tyloses. And it closes off those capillaries when you put the lumber into a kiln. So the cherry is an elegant wood, leaves a sense of elegance in any built environment. Beech is white, and it has heartwood that's reddish, but it's a strong wood and great for multiple uses in flooring, moldings, and millwork. So to teach a bit about sustainable hardwoods, how Canada manages their resource, I have to dispel first the notion that many people in North America have when you get an email that says, don't print this email. That can let you think that by cutting down any tree, even the trees to make wood, you're decimating the resource, which is not true. But when you see images of burning rainforests, this is the unsustainable conversion to agricultural use, and I already talked about that. But the Canadian forests have been maintained sustainably, which will assure plentiful supply well into the future, and the wood from those forests will help bring beauty to the world in all of the uses I've already outlined, and at the same time sequestering carbon and mitigating the effects of climate change. I was asked this question on Tuesday, so I'm going to answer it before somebody might ask it, because if you fly over the forests of America and Canada, you'll get to the Rockies, you'll see nothing but verdant forest land. And then you get to the Rockies, and past the Rockies, the woods, the forests are more dominated by softwoods, and you'll see these clear cuttings where softwoods that are shade intolerant need all the sunlight they can get to grow. So the commercial enterprises that own land will cut softwoods, just clear the whole football field size patch of land and replant by hand, which is what you have to do. Weyerhaeuser, for example, replanted after the Mount St. Helens eruption 1981, which blew down a ton of trees on their land. They own 45,000 acres, and they salvaged all that timber because it wasn't pulverized. It was just knocked down by the force of the blast. But they used that all for joists and trusses and building materials. But then they replanted 18.4 million trees by hand, which was quite an effort. But if you look at satellite imagery of Mount St. Helens in 1981 versus 2020, you'll see that a very vibrant forest has grown that assures wildlife habitat. And the trees may not be 250 feet tall yet, but left to its own devices, that land that's owned by the feds in the States will eventually regrow. But we have to remember that we as humans are an eye blink in eternity. So the earth will grow that back eventually, but for commercial use, we want to maintain it. And anyway, so we're going to learn about, in the forest, we're going to learn about forest management, and learning while sitting under the trees is a really good idea. But all of Canada's forest resources managed under very rigorous standards. The silviculture prescription system set forth by the NHRI, it outlines exactly how you have to maintain for the forests for future generations. I'll look at Ontario here. 90% of Ontario's forests are on Crown land. 44% of Ontario's Crown land forests are managed forests. So by law, all harvested forests on Crown land in Canada must be regenerated to the previous state. So this silvicultural prescription system, it's a 5-step process, starting with the description of a stand and then recommending specific treatments in forests dominated by hardwoods. I'll say this about certification: it's voluntary. It does cost money for the industry, but it's multinational third parties providing the set of guidelines that the industry has to meet in order to receive this certification, which assures the consumer that this is truly sustainably managed. But these guidelines include the silvicultural practices, wildlife habitat protection, safety protocols, and very importantly, Indigenous consultation. We want to make sure that no rights of the Indigenous population are infringed in any way whatsoever. This is a costly but valuable undertaking for the industry, opening doors to many markets. 2 examples, most prevalent, are the SFI, which has to do with softwoods more preeminently, and then the Forest Stewardship Council, which is more hardwoods. The takeaway here is that Canada has the most independent certified forest area in the world. This is an example of forest land that has been harvested over the generations. But you'll see, because we're only taking the 80-year trees, the most mature trees, out of that stand of timber, and we're opening the canopy, and new trees start to grow in their place. So it's a constantly rotating crop. Here's an example of foresters going in to log a particular area. You can see on his piece of paperwork there is predicting the vigor of that stand of trees. We're going to go in with certified foresters who are going to look for that mature tree. And lest anybody call me on this 80-year thing, some trees mature earlier and some later, but it's up to these guys to determine which are the most mature trees. They're measuring girth, height, health, and they'll say this tree can come out and allow the forest floor to regenerate. So she's just measuring the girth and looking at height. because we want to make these determinations in a calculated way. So the forester on the right is standing next to a tree that could easily be harvested and let new trees grow. So here those foresters go into another stand of timber to evaluate it for the next harvest. Here's an example of a forest floor starting to regenerate now that sunlight and rain's reaching it. Here's an example of maple tree busting through the tree-lined forest floor, and those seedlings are going to, or saplings, if you want to call it that way, they're going to start absorbing carbon in an aggressive way, and the forest will be renewed, and the trees in another 50 years will have been completely replaced. You have to use machinery to get all these logs out of the woods, but the goal is to leave as light a footprint as possible. Back in the early 1900s, they would pull logs out with draft horses, but we've evolved past that. Here's some logs sitting in the woods, showing you the sap and the heart. This is birch logs. Those logs are carried then to a sawmill. And here's just some more birch bark for you. It's a beautiful wood. This is hard maple logs. You can see the small heart and the big sap, which allows if you were to specify white hard maple, for example, the color of the sapwood in Canada is a lot whiter than it is further south in North America. So white hard maple is really a feature of Canadian hardwoods. This is another birch log with a bright red heart to it, and you can see tight growth rings there if you really look closely at the picture. So when the logs are brought out of the forest and to the log yard, they're measured for grade. One of the things to keep in mind if you have specified wood for a project, it's always the 11th hour part of the project, right? So value engineering can step in and say that wood's too expensive. We're not going to be able to meet the budget because I, the general contractor, have bought a bunch of trucks for my firm and we ran out of money. That's just me being facetious, but you have to understand that all the lumber is graded to a standard for North America, the National Hardwood Lumber Association rules, which means that the highest grade board, the one that costs the most, is the clearest. In red oak, for example, it's 6 inches wide, 8 feet long of clear lumber. The next step down is one common. That is less expensive, allows more knots, but the wood between the knots is the same. So if your cuttings, if you're looking for kitchen cabinetry, for example, your cuttings don't need to be wider than 2.5, 3 inches, and the length of the cabinet doors is not higher than 36 inches. So you can gain significant economies by understanding those grades, and your distributor will help you. But when we talk about carbon sequestration, this is just actively growing timber. This is a tree that was allowed to go past its prime and it's already started to leach carbon back in the atmosphere, and the one behind it is still holding carbon. All of the all the logs come to a sawmill that cuts them into boards. Once we kiln dry that board to a factor of 6 to 8% of its weight when it came off the log, where it held 60% water, as we are 60% water, that if we dry that board down to 6 to 8% of its original weight, and the water is the weight, that board will adapt to a slightly more arid or humid environment without cracking and blowing apart. So 6 to 8% is the magic number there. So as I wrap up and try to get to a chance for questions from you, let's review why you should specify Canadian hardwoods. There's a wide range of species and grades to suit almost any budget. We've seen that it's sustainably managed under rigorous scientific standards. It's slow growth with those tight grain patterns, tight growth rings, very consistent color. It's consistent quality and durability that will last seriously for generations. I know in commercial spaces, designers look at replacing it all in a hotel or whatever in 10 years, but understand that certainly for high-end residential and other commercial things like schools and churches, it'll last for generations, hundreds of years. Brings this beautiful, unsurpassed elegance and warmth to any interior space. It is price competitive with non-natural materials such as metals and plastics, but it's renewable, recyclable, and biodegradable. And it also promotes healthy living by being free of airborne pollutants. As a matter of fact, it makes your space healthier just by being installed. One thing to remember is that you can say, I want to put carpet in this high-end home, but after about 10 years, that carpet needs to be replaced. And if you're lazy, you replace it at 15 years. Replace it with wood flooring, and there's no way for pet dander and to soak in. I'm sorry, there's something happening here?
No, we had somebody join and they were not on mute. So I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah,
I just didn't
now.
want to ignore somebody. Okay, but anyway, the point is that if you replace that carpet with wood flooring, it won't absorb all of those pollutants. But if you took a square foot of that carpet and sent it to a lab, you would be shocked by what's growing in your carpet in terms of bacteria, even if you've steam cleaned it once a year religiously. So anyway, I'll just leave that at that. But Canadian hardwoods are readily available through American distributors. You'll see some of their logos at the end. And it's FSC certified, available, all graded to the same standard across North America. And remember that 50% of the hardwood weight is stored carbon, which will remain stored through the use. It's the whole life of the product until it burns, which we hope it doesn't. Here's an example of some of the distributors here in the US. And take a screenshot of this because Richard Lippman, who's the director of the Canadian Hardwood Bureau, he's going to be going forward your source for answers to questions I haven't answered, for example, today. But yeah, take a shot of this. And remember, there's a Dropbox chock full of great specific information. So listen, everybody, I'm going to bring my camera back in just so I can visibly show myself, and thank you for your attention. Jen, you can take my screen back over.
All right.
But thank you all. And Jen, always great working with you, and I'll work with you again soon.
Absolutely.